For me, the silence was always the worst part. It never got easier, no matter how many times I lived through it. It always started the same way. Muted shouting, angry voices pounding through walls so thin they might as well have been paper, like a man beating rhythm into the drywall with his temper. Then came something sharper, a quick, frightened sound that barely existed before it was swallowed whole. After that, a dull, heavy impact, the kind that makes your stomach drop and your skin crawl. And then nothing, just a low, ringing quiet, a kind of silence that somehow felt louder than any scream ever could. I was sitting at my small kitchen table, my fingers clenched around a coffee mug that had gone cold a long time ago. I hadn't noticed. My knuckles were white. My body was still. My breathing was shallow and wrong. I was listening to the absence of sound from the apartment next door. That quiet felt haunted, wrong, like empty air where a child's cry should have been. I'd been hearing the fights for months, ever since the new family moved into 2B. At first, I told myself to stay out of it. People argue. Doors slam. That's just the background noise of a cheap apartment building. Everyone trapped inside everyone else's problems. But this time was different. Something had changed. The arguments were the same, but now there was another layer underneath them. Something darker. The sound of a little girl being scared. I'd only seen her a few times in the hallway. She was tiny, smaller than she should have been. Big, alert eyes. Hair the color of dried straw. She never smiled. Not once. Even when summer heat pressed down on the building, she wore long sleeves, like she was hiding from the world or from being seen. One day, I noticed something I wish I could forget. Her father, Rick, grabbed her arm to pull her along, and her sleeve slid up just enough to show it. A bruise. Dark. Ugly. Like a plum left too long on the counter. She flinched immediately, her eyes darting around, checking to see if anyone had noticed. Then she saw me, and the fear in her stare hit so hard it felt like the air was ripped straight out of my lungs. I'm a mechanic. I make sense of things with my hands. I know how to fix an engine that won't fire, how to true a bent wheel, how to take broken parts and make them whole again. But this wasn't that kind of broken. This was delicate, fragile, and I didn't have the right tools. I lived quietly by design. I worked my shifts, came home, and polished the chrome on my Harley until I could see my own tired face reflected back at me. I kept to myself for a reason. A past that taught me it was safer not to get involved in other people's messes. The authorities and I had history. Bad history. I'd learned that lesson the hard way a long time ago. Still, the silence next door wouldn't leave me alone. It screamed without making a sound, vibrating through concrete and steel until it settled deep in my bones. I closed my eyes, but it didn't help. Her face burned itself onto the back of my eyelids. That quiet wasn't just the lack of noise. It was an answer. It was the sound a monster makes when it gets what it wants. I slowly opened my hand and set the mug down. It made a soft click against the table. In that moment, I knew two things. I couldn't fix this with a wrench, and I couldn't pretend it wasn't happening anymore. The problem was, I had no idea what I was supposed to do. From then on, my days became quiet observation, not because I was curious, but because something old and instinctive had woken up inside me. Rick left every morning at 6 sharp for his construction job, his heavy boots slamming down the hallway like he was already angry at the day. A few hours later, Sarah would leave for her part-time shift at the grocery store. She moved like she was trying to disappear, shoulders rounded, eyes glued to the floor, as if looking up might bring trouble. That left Lily alone with him in the evenings. And that's when things went bad. Really bad. I started leaving my door cracked open, just enough to hear the hallway. One afternoon, I saw Lily sitting on the top stair, clutching a teddy bear that looked older than she was. She wasn't playing. She wasn't crying. She was just sitting there, completely still, like she was waiting for something she didn't want to arrive. When she noticed me, she flinched and ran back inside before I could even say a word. Another time, I watched Rick drag her toward the car. She stumbled, and he yanked her up by the arm, his fingers digging in like claws. "Get up," he snapped. "Stop being so clumsy." Lily didn't cry. She didn't make a sound. She just blinked, her face blank in a way no child's face should ever be. Like she'd learned silence was safer. Inside me, the argument never stopped. Call the cops. That's what you're supposed to do. That's the right thing. But I'd seen how that story usually ended. Officers show up. Rick smiles. Sarah stays quiet. Lily gets coached into silence. The cops leave. And then the real punishment begins. The thought of making things worse for that little girl froze me in place. I felt trapped, forced to watch something terrible unfold in slow motion. Most nights, I hid in my garage. The smell of oil and gasoline brought a strange comfort. I'd run my hands over the cool metal of my bike, reminding myself of the code I lived by. You look out for your own. You respect the road. You don't let bullies win. Lately, that code felt hollow. What good was leather and steel if I sat back and did nothing while a child suffered just a few feet away? I felt like a coward. Every night, I went back to my apartment, sat in the dark, and listened. My whole body was wound tight, like a spring stretched too far. I was waiting. I didn't know for what, only that a line was coming. And once it was crossed, I knew I wouldn't be able to turn away. That line was crossed on a Tuesday. Cold rain fell in a miserable drizzle, soaking the building and matching the weight in the air. Rick came home early. His voice was thick with cheap whiskey, angry, sloppy. The argument started low, poisonous. Then it rose. Something crashed, glass, maybe. Sarah screamed. I pressed my ear to the wall, my heart pounding against my ribs. Then I heard Rick again. His voice was clear now. Too clear. Cold. Controlled. "You think you can defy me in my own house," he said. "You and that worthless brat. You tell anyone. and I swear to God I'll put you both in the ground." The words hung there, heavy and suffocating. But what finally broke me wasn't his voice. It was hers. Not a scream, not a sob, just a tiny, trembling whisper I almost didn't hear. "I'm sorry, Daddy." Those words landed like a headstone for a childhood that never even got a chance to begin. It was the sound of a young spirit being ground down slowly. A little girl learning the cruelest lesson there is, that survival meant pleasing the very person who was supposed to protect her. That whisper did what all the yelling and crashing never could. It sliced straight through my fear, my hesitation, every excuse I'd built to convince myself this wasn't my problem. It wasn't just sound anymore. It was a cry for help. A signal flare fired from a ship already taking on water. I stumbled back from the wall, my stomach rolling hard enough to make me gag. My chest tightened, and for a moment I couldn't get air into my lungs. Her face flashed in my mind, those wide, empty eyes. The bruise, that small, broken apology whispered into the dark. That was it. I knew I couldn't just stand there anymore. Standing by wasn't neutral. It was just cowardice with a better view. I crossed my living room in a hurry, my thoughts suddenly sharp, focused, and terrifyingly clear. Going in alone wouldn't make me brave. It would make me stupid. Rick was bigger than me, drunk and angry, and that kind of confrontation only ends one way. I'd wind up in jail, and Lily would be left alone with him afterward, paying for my mistake. Calling the police felt like a gamble I wasn't willing to take. Not now. Not with her life hanging in the balance. This needed something different. It needed a message. It needed presence. Enough of it that there would be no argument, no resistance, and no chance this would ever happen again. I pulled out my phone and stared at a number I hadn't dialed in years. A number tied to a part of my life I'd walked away from on purpose. One that could solve this, but only by dragging a whole lot of trouble back into my world. Making that call felt like pulling the pin on a grenade. Once you do it, there's no controlling where the damage spreads. I took a deep, unsteady breath and thought about Lily's whisper. "I'm sorry, Daddy." Then I pressed call. The phone rang twice before a rough voice answered. "Yeah, Bear," I said. "It's Patch." There was a pause. "Patch," he said finally. "Been a long time. What do you want?" His voice was flat and sharp. No patience. No softness. Bear was the kind of man people respected because they were afraid not to. Dangerous. Unyielding. The last person you ever wanted to owe. My own voice felt tight, but I forced it steady. Weakness wasn't an option. "I need help," I said. "Not for me." I didn't waste time. I told him about the apartment next door. The fights. The fear in the mother's eyes. The little girl. The long sleeves. The bruises. Then I told him exactly what I'd just heard through the wall. The threat and the whisper that was still ringing in my ears. I didn't add drama. I didn't exaggerate. I just laid out the facts, one after another, my voice low and urgent. The silence on the other end weighed heavy. I could hear a bar somewhere in the background, glasses clinking, music playing faintly. For a moment, I thought he might hang up and tell me to deal with it myself. Then he spoke again, and the edge in his voice was gone. What replaced it was cold, solid, like steel left out in winter. "You sure about this, Patch?" "I've never been more sure of anything," I said. The words tasted like iron. Another pause, then a single question. "You see marks on the kid?" "Once," I said. "Her arm. Dark bruises." He grabbed her. "She hides it." That was all he needed. The decision was already made. "Which apartment?" "2B. "Don't do anything," Bear said. It wasn't advice. It was an order. "Don't go over there. Don't call anyone else. Sit tight." Then he said, "We're coming." The line went dead. I lowered the phone slowly, my hand shaking now. What had I just done? Whatever came next, my quiet, invisible life was finished. There was no going back. I walked over to the window and looked out at the rain-soaked street. Empty. Still. Bathed in the dull orange glow of the streetlights. Have you ever made a decision so big you could almost feel the world shift? Like something deep and unseen had just locked into a new position? That's exactly what it felt like. I was terrified, and for the first time in months, I felt a thin thread of hope. I waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The silence inside my apartment felt ready to burst. I paced the floor, every creak sounding too loud. My ears strained toward the wall, listening for anything next door, afraid I'd just made things worse for her. Then I felt it. A low vibration, distant at first. I felt it in my teeth before I heard it. A sound I knew well, the steady thump of a V-twin engine. It didn't stay alone. Another joined it, then another, and another. The hum grew into a rumble. The rumble turned into a roar. It rolled closer like thunder, shaking the windows in their frames. It sounded like something big was coming. I looked out the window again. The street wasn't empty anymore. Motorcycles poured in from both ends, one at a time, then in groups, then in waves. Chrome and steel flooding a block that had never seen anything like it. They weren't loud. They weren't reckless. No revving. No shouting. Just calm, deliberate movement that was far more unsettling than chaos. They parked in tight, staggered rows, headlights cutting through the rain until the whole street looked locked down. Men in leather vests stepped off their bikes. Same patch on every back. No words exchanged. Just arms crossed, bodies still, forming a wall that didn't need explaining. The street was sealed. Nothing was coming in or going out. Then came the knock on my door. It wasn't polite. It wasn't a question. It was a summons. I opened it and found Bear standing there. Up close, he was enormous. A wall of a man with a graying beard and eyes that looked like they'd seen every dark corner of this world. 2 others stood beside him, both built like they could lift a truck. Bear skipped the small talk. His eyes swept over me once, sharp and assessing. "Which one?" he asked. My throat was dry. I lifted my hand and pointed down the hall. Bear nodded once. Then he turned and started walking. The leather of their vests creaked softly as they moved. I followed a few steps behind, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might tear loose. They stopped in front of the door. From inside the apartment, I heard Rick again. His voice was loud, tight with anger, cutting through the door like a blade. Bear didn't knock. He didn't raise his voice or announce himself. He simply turned his head toward one of the men beside him, a massive guy built like a wall. "Now," Bear said quietly. The man stepped back once, lifted his heavy boot, and drove it forward. The sound filled the hallway, sharp and final. The door gave way, the lock failing in an instant, and the door swung inward, slamming against the wall. For a heartbeat, everything stopped. Rick stood frozen, his face flushed and twisted, one hand still raised. Lily was near the couch, small and rigid. Sarah was pressed into the corner, tears streaking down her face. The air inside smelled sour and heavy, thick with fear and old neglect. Rick spun around, shock flashing into fury. "What is this?" he shouted. "Who are you?" Bear didn't answer him. He didn't even look his way. I'd never seen authority like that. Rick wasn't a problem to Bear. He wasn't even something that needed attention. He simply didn't register. Bear's eyes went straight to Lily. They softened. He moved slowly, deliberately, making sure every step said you're safe. He passed Rick without a glance and carefully lowered himself to the floor. It took effort. He was a big man, but he made himself smaller anyway. When he spoke, his voice was calm and steady, almost gentle, nothing like the force that had opened the door. "Hey there," he said softly. "I'm Bear. We're here to help you leave this place." Rick finally snapped out of it and lunged forward with borrowed confidence. "Get out of my house," he yelled. He didn't get far. One of the men stepped in smoothly and placed a single hand against Rick's chest. No shove, no strike, just presence. Rick stopped instantly, like he'd run into something solid. He looked around then, really looked, at the men filling the doorway, at the stillness, at the calm certainty in their faces. Whatever fight he thought he had left drained out of him. His shoulders sagged. His color faded. He finally felt the fear he'd been handing out for years. Bear never turned back. He stayed focused on Lily. "It's okay," he said gently. "No one is going to hurt you anymore. That's done." For the first time, Lily lifted her head. She looked at this big, bearded man and saw something she hadn't seen in a long time. Kindness. Slowly, cautiously, she reached out and touched the front of his vest. Not curious about what it was, just needing to know he was real. Bear nodded, like he understood. Then he turned to Sarah, who was still frozen in place. His voice stayed firm, but there was no threat in it. "Ma'am," he said, "grab what matters. Just the essentials. You're both leaving." It wasn't an order meant to control. It was a door opening. Something shifted in Sarah. Hope flickered where fear had lived too long. She moved quickly now, grabbing a bag and filling it with whatever she could. The pressure in the room lifted. I felt it in my chest. Outside, the steady sound of engines idling wasn't loud or aggressive. It was steady, reassuring, like someone standing watch. I stayed in the doorway, taking it all in. All I'd done was make a call. I trusted a feeling I couldn't ignore. And somehow help showed up. Not loud, not violent, just present. The years that followed proved that night wasn't a one-time thing. When authorities eventually arrived, after neighbors called about an unusual gathering, the situation was already calm. Rick was taken away without resistance. With witnesses willing to speak and the truth finally out in the open, he was gone from their lives for good. But the people who helped didn't disappear. Lily and Sarah weren't alone anymore. They were helped into a clean apartment in a safer part of town. Sarah found steady work. Problems stopped becoming emergencies. Help came quietly, without needing to be asked. They didn't hover. They didn't control. They just stayed close enough to matter. My life changed too. I wasn't on the outside anymore. Somewhere along the way, I stopped being alone. I was there for Lily's 7th birthday. I watched her laugh, really laugh, as Bear handed her a small gift he'd clearly put thought into. Nothing flashy, just something that said you belong. Over time, I became Uncle Patch. I taught Lily how to take care of her first car, guiding her hands patiently, watching her confidence grow. The fear in her eyes faded, replaced by curiosity and strength. I found something I didn't even know I was missing. Not noise, not power, belonging. That call I almost didn't make didn't just change 2 lives. It changed mine. Years later, I stood beside Bear as Lily crossed the stage, diploma in hand, smiling like the future was finally hers. I glanced over and saw Bear quietly wipe his eyes, hoping no one noticed. That's when I understood something for good. Real strength doesn't need an audience. And the people who save us rarely look like heroes at first glance. Later that evening, at her graduation party, Lily stood up to speak. The room settled into a hush. She began with her mother, thanking her for strength she didn't know she had, for holding on when giving up would have been easier. Then Lily looked out across the crowd. Big men, beards, leather jackets, not family by blood, but the people who had become her uncles, her protectors, her home. They say you can't choose your family, she said, steady and sure. I don't believe that. She paused, letting the silence do its work. You can choose. My family came for me on the darkest night of my life. They showed up like thunder and chrome, and they taught me what real strength and real love actually look like. Her eyes found me. My chest tightened, because everything she was talking about traced back to one small moment. One person choosing to listen to a whisper through a wall. What happened that night turned into a quiet kind of legend around town. Not the kind you read about. The kind people pass along softly. A reminder that justice doesn't always come with a badge. and that angels don't always have wings. Sometimes they arrive with engines that make the ground hum. Sometimes they wear patches that stand for loyalty that doesn't bend. Sarah changed too. She wasn't the frightened shadow of herself anymore. She found her voice and put it to work, helping others at a local women's shelter. When she shared her story, she always ended the same way. "Don't give up hope," she'd say. "Help can come from anywhere." Another year has passed now. We're together again at the annual barbecue, a tradition that began as a simple celebration of Lily's freedom. She's by the fire pit, laughing with friends, confident, grounded, a law student with her whole life stretching out in front of her. I watch her with a beer in my hand, a deep, quiet calm settling into my chest. Bear steps up beside me and grips my shoulder, firm and familiar. "You did good, brother," he says. "You really did." I don't say much. I just nod, keeping my eyes on the young woman whose life almost went a very different direction. I think back to who I used to be, alone in a quiet apartment, afraid to get involved, afraid of making things worse. That's when it clicks. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's deciding fear doesn't get the last word. It's not always loud. It's not always dramatic. Sometimes it's a quiet choice, a gut feeling you refuse to ignore, that small voice that says, "This isn't right." Real strength shows up the moment you decide to listen and act. Heroes are everywhere. Most of the time, they don't look like heroes at all. They look like mechanics, like bikers, like quiet neighbors who notice when something feels off. They're the ones who listen to the silence. So I'll leave you with this. Have you ever had a moment when something felt wrong, even if no one else seemed to notice? What did you do? Your story matters more than you think. You never know who might hear it and decide to listen.